My Sentinel is suffering from limp liver, so I'm going to go in there and see if I can do anything to fix it. First step, of course, is to open it up. We're going to pop out the side plates here to reveal 2 screws underneath those, pop off the buttstock, take out the long screw underneath the lever, and then all of the rest of the screws should be the same length. Once you have those, set them aside, perhaps in a small cup or something like that, and just clamshell open the 2 halves of the shell. This is pretty standard for a Sentinel. Here we see the problem. There is a pin that has fallen out of the blue lever. So I'm going to remove that, and don't lose that cylindrical spacer between the blue lever and the body. That is absolutely critical to the function of this device. Now you see that pin has fallen into the orange track down there. I'm picking it up here, and I tried to press it in at first using just a pair of pliers. However, there is another piece that you need right here. That is another little roller that goes on top of that. So before you press it in, let's get a closer look. New hardware, nice. So before you press this in, you're going to want to put that roller on the steel pin there, and I'm going to put a little bit of a kind of a quasi-knurl on that pin by just squeezing it between some pliers. I'm basically forcing material into the spaces between the teeth of the pliers, that way it'll grip the steel a little bit better on the lever. I'm going to use a bit of epoxy just to make doubly sure that this does not fall out, and I'm going to put a little tiny piece of epoxy right in that hole. Then I'm going to bang the whole assembly together. A hammer would be better. And just press that in with the pliers. Make sure everything still rolls around, and don't put too much epoxy on there. Now I'm going to mark out where I want to cut the shell roughly, and you'll see it's going to change a bit throughout the build. I'm probably going to cut that even a little bit shorter here. And this is just very, very easy plastic to saw through. It is Busby plastic after all. A simple hacksaw is really all you need. No Dremel required, no fancy tools. Just be careful and use a little bit of elbow grease. Gonna cut off the front, and then I'm just also going to use my hacksaw to cut off the back end as well. Now here's the fun part. Now I wanted to make an internal magazine that would be exclusively top-fed on my Sentinel. Now this sounds like a great idea, except it isn't going to work. Here is, for posterity, what I ended up doing, and perhaps somebody else can do it a little bit better. The top-feeding magazine just really doesn't work very well. But I cut through the top here, and through most of the front of the shell as well. That cut off the top spring-loaded arm, which kept the darts seated inside of the magazine. That's really the problem here. If you want to do this, you would need another piece added. I cut off a little bit from the front of the barrel, and that was just to allow easier loading from the top. And here it's just a matter of shaving everything down. Really, you just have to keep trial and error testing this out to see when this would fit best. Next would be to open up the magazine. Once you take out those 2 screws, just open it up with your hands and pull it apart. It will open up like a hinge, basically. I'm sawing mine off at the bottom down to that ridge, and we're going to test that out, see if it fits together here. Test fitting that in place, I'm going to also put the follower in and the main spring for the magazine. Now I thought I could very easily slip that spring onto the rear screw port, but that isn't going to work either because, well, it's too far back. Everything binds up. That rear winding of the spring just gets caught before anything happens, so you really can only load 1 or 2 that way. This is not an efficient way to do it. To get rid of the front, I removed a piece of this screw port here and then just cleaned it up. Here I traced the outline of the shell onto a piece of 1/2-inch polycarbonate and cut that out just to see if it would fit. I shaved off a little bit more just to see where that would need to fit in relation to the barrel, and I cut off the barrel as well. To make the internal fix magazine, I'm going to take a piece of 1/8-inch polycarbonate, and similarly, as we've done with the front cover of the blaster, I'm going to just trace around what I see there and cut that out. For the rear, that's a very complex geometry, so I'm going to use a block of wood. It's very easy to work with, so I'm just going to trace out where I need to make some shallow cuts, and I'm going to use my Dremel to cut that out. Just kidding, I'm going to use a hacksaw and a vise. Again, you don't need a Dremel to do any of this. Everything here can be done with simple, inexpensive hand tools and just a little bit of care. Now, when I have that shaped correctly, using just a hacksaw and a rat tail file, and when I know that that fits pretty well in the back, we'll come back to that later when the internals are done. Now, let's reassemble the insides. Make sure that the notch is downwards on the plunger tube, and stick that all together. Put the spacer on the screw port, and then put the blue lever back on. Give it a quick function test if you want. Make sure everything's there and working properly. And my lever wasn't pulling down at first, so I wasn't sure what was going on, but this is the problem right here. Make sure that little post that's sticking up is in front of that lever loop right there. There you go, now everything should clear just fine. Try cycling it a few times, let's see how it operates. And, well, we still can't put darts in there because of that top tooth that's in the way. So I ended up cutting that down quite a bit. I just sawed off first the finger that was sticking out, and then the actual half barrel itself, about 1/4 to 1/2 inch. Again, I don't recommend doing this step, and I do recommend just leaving the original magazine in place and removable. That's probably the best way that you can do this. Top loading on this does not really work, at least for me. I know a couple of other people have experimented with it, but for me, it just doesn't seem to work. So let's reassemble and see what we got to do. I'm going to put the main screw back in on the lever and put the other screws back in as well. And we need to deal with this fixed magazine. So I'm going to see where I need to put another, basically a post to hold my spring inside the magazine. I'm going to drill right through there. So here I have a brass rod actually. You could use a steel rod or really anything that will fit the spring loop. I test fitted that in, put the follower and spring back in, and then I inserted my steel rod right through the spring loop, and that's what held everything in. Tap that right in, and now when we reassemble that, it's going to go right underneath the blue plate on the side of the blaster, and nobody will be the wiser. Here I am just filling the gaps with epoxy putty, and then I'm going to throw on the 1/8 inch polycarb sheet that we made earlier. And then I'm going to drill a couple of holes and sink some screws in there, and that will hold it on quite permanently. Make sure you chamfer those. You don't want metal screw heads sticking out. You want them nice and countersunk. Screw those right in, and it's very easy plastic to cut through, so just screw it right in. It will self-tap. Here you can see I'm just using my knife to cut off some of that epoxy while it's semi-wet still, so it's still in a green state, so I can work with it pretty easily. Once it's completely dried, sand that down, and I sanded on the polycarbonate, the Lexan as well, because I wanted to give it kind of a frosted look. I didn't like it completely clear like that. If it's frosted, it kind of hides the imperfections of the epoxy putty. So finally I can stick in the front spacer now that we've sealed it up and see how well that fits. We can go back to this later and screw that in at the end. I'm going to focus on the wood piece first on the back. This is an easy thing to adhere. I'm just going to drill a hole in and then make sure it's countersunk nice and well and screw those together. I'm going to cut off the excess with my hacksaw, and then using a sanding block and some files, I'm just going to make sure that that's sanded flush and there's no burrs sticking out. So that's the rear end of the mare's leg. That looks pretty good. Gonna put the screws back in there. And finally, they still weren't feeding well. The darts still weren't feeding very well in the front, so this was my final modification to help feed into the magazine. Finally, I wanted just a bit of a cosmetic mod, so I found some paracord that matched pretty well to the rest of the blaster, and I bought that. Now, if you do this mod, drill further forward, don't drill all the way back here, because that drill ran right into the support structures for the dart gate at the front of the blaster, right in front of the breech. I was lucky that I did not actually break anything. but don't do it. Go a little bit further up, even just a 1/4 inch further up. You're not going to see any problems. I use the tip of a torsion spring to stuff that paracord into the hole I had made, and then used a little bit of epoxy to glue the ends that were sticking out of the hole basically in place, so I made doubly sure that it would not move. I added some epoxy to the top and the bottom of where I wanted to wrap this thing around, and then I just wrapped the paracord around the whole blaster several times, and that just adds a nice little flare to the front. I used a screw to just shove that into a hole I made in the front of the blaster, and likewise I put some epoxy in there as well. Now here's the finished blaster, and it looks pretty good, so let's see how it shoots. Remember, the internals are still stock for the most part. It's just that I've made these kind of pistol-ish modifications to it. Now, as you can see, I'm having a bit of difficulty loading this. This is not something you'd want to load in the middle of an HVZ game or a Nerf war or something like that. This is more of a last resort kind of pistol, or a humiliation pistol, we'll say. Let's give this a shot and see how it functions. And it's a stock Sentinel, so you know it's not going to be bad in terms of performance. However, as you could see, I am struggling a little bit reloading this one at a time. You have to position the darts in such a way where you rock them in to the magazine here. Reload all 4. That's the maximum capacity on this guy now. There's a couple of different ways that you can hold this if you want to flip fire this thing. However, I do not recommend that because the darts will either fly out or you'll end up either jamming this guy or cutting the darts in half. So flip firing this blaster is not recommended. I really don't think you should do it. Gripping the blaster from the midsection is probably a better way to hold this in general. It will give you a fast follow-up shot if you need it, and a lot of control on the blaster. And in summary, the idea of a Mare's Leg Sentinel is pretty great, but the internal magazine on one is not. I hope I showed you how you can solve a problem if you experience one on the now dying out breed of Sentinels, and have a nice day.